You know what's fascinating? For the longest time, the avoidant thrives on their partner's warmth. They rely on the fact that someone else will keep showing up, keep trying, keep pouring love into the connection, because deep down they fear intimacy but crave it at the same time. Now, enter the super empath. This is not your everyday empath. This is someone who has poured themselves out so many times that eventually they learn the power of boundaries. They learn how to flip the switch. And when they do, their heart doesn't go lukewarm, it goes ice cold. And here's the kicker: the avoidant, who's used to pulling away, suddenly finds themselves being pulled away from, and they can't handle it. Why? Because for the first time, they're not in control. The emotional oxygen they've depended on is gone. The super empath doesn't lash out, doesn't chase, doesn't beg. They simply stop investing. That silence, that stillness, it's deafening. To the avoidant, it feels like standing in a room where the music suddenly cuts off. And the lesson, the very thing the avoidant runs from, deep connection, is the very thing they lose forever when they push the wrong person too far. When we look at someone with avoidant tendencies in relationships, what's really happening beneath the surface is a push-pull dynamic that feels safe to them. They crave closeness, but the moment they feel it, their walls come up and they back away. But here's the interesting part: they don't walk away completely. They hover. They linger. They stay just close enough so that the other person, usually someone with an empathetic nature, keeps reaching out. It's like they've learned that if they pull away a few steps, someone will always follow to close the gap. That's where the avoidant finds their comfort, not in the connection itself, but in the reassurance that someone else will do the work to maintain it. This reliance is subtle. The avoidant often doesn't even consciously realize they're doing it. They'll say things like, "I just need space," or "I'm not good at relationships," and then expect the other person to patiently wait to continue proving their loyalty and love. It's almost as though the avoidant has outsourced the responsibility of the relationship to their partner. They want the security of knowing someone is there, but they don't want to risk being the one to keep it alive. That dynamic works when they're with someone who's naturally giving, someone who equates love with effort, someone who believes that if they just love harder, the other person will eventually meet them in the middle. Enter the empath, and especially the super empath. At first, the avoidant feels like they've hit the jackpot. Here is someone who is intuitive, nurturing, patient, and emotionally intelligent. The super empath senses the avoidant's fears and does everything in their power to create a safe space. They forgive the pullbacks. They rationalize the distance. They keep investing. Every time the avoidant takes a step back, the super empath takes a step forward, bridging the gap. And the avoidant comes to rely on this dynamic more than they realize. But this reliance is a fragile illusion. Because what the avoidant doesn't account for is that the empath's energy isn't endless. Even the most selfless person has a breaking point. What the avoidant mistakes for unconditional love is actually a choice the empath makes every day to keep showing up, and choices can change. The avoidant, however, assumes the pattern is fixed. They pull away. The empath closes in. Balance is restored. They depend on that rhythm like a dance they think they'll never have to lead. This dependence becomes clear only when the empath begins to shift. The avoidant notices the silence, the lack of pursuit, the absence of emotional labor. Suddenly, the relationship feels different, colder, emptier. And that's when the avoidant realizes just how much they've relied on someone else to carry the weight. Until that moment, they thought they were in control, but in truth, they were leaning heavily on their partner's willingness to sustain the connection. The avoidant wasn't protecting their independence. They were depending on the empath's persistence. And that's the paradox they never see coming. Every empath has a threshold, even though it may not look that way in the beginning. When someone is naturally giving, intuitive, and deeply attuned to the needs of others, it can seem as though their capacity to love and nurture has no limits. The avoidant often leans into this belief, assuming that no matter how many times they retreat, the empath will always step forward. What they don't understand is that empaths, particularly those often referred to as super empaths, are not naive. They may forgive and they may be patient, but they are also highly aware. They notice every withdrawal, every silent punishment, every moment of emotional unavailability. At first, they choose compassion over confrontation, because their instinct is to heal, not to fight. But over time, that instinct shifts. the super empath begins to recognize patterns. They see how much they are giving compared to what they are receiving. They see how their love is being met with distance instead of reciprocity. And in that recognition, a subtle but powerful change takes place. The very same empathy that once drove them to overextend becomes the fuel for building boundaries. They realize that continuing to give endlessly is not compassion, it's self-abandonment. Their capacity for love doesn't vanish, it simply redirects. Instead of pouring into someone who continually pulls away, they begin pouring into themselves. This is the breaking point that the avoidant never anticipates. The super empath is not someone who burns out with resentment and lashes out in anger. Their shift is quieter, calmer, almost serene. They stop chasing not out of spite, but out of self-respect. They stop explaining, not because they don't care, but because they realize their care has been undervalued. It's like a light switch flips inside them. What once felt like an obligation to heal becomes a determination to protect. And when this switch flips, there is no dramatic speech, no pleading for change. There is simply distance delivered with grace. To the avoidant, this transformation feels disorienting. They were accustomed to being pursued, to being reassured after every retreat, to having someone else patch the holes in the connection. Now, the super empath is no longer stepping forward. They're no longer carrying the burden of closeness. And because they do it without drama, it's even more unsettling. There are no arguments to pull them back in, no emotional fireworks to keep the cycle alive. Just a sudden, unmistakable absence of energy. This boundary is not about punishment. The super empath does not go cold to teach a lesson. They do it because they've recognized their own worth and can no longer justify pouring love into a void. Their breaking point is the moment they realize they deserve reciprocity, and once they cross that line, they don't return. What makes them powerful is not how much they can give, but that they know exactly when to stop giving. This inner strength turns their love into something unshakable, first for themselves, and then only for those who know how to honor it. When the super empath finally reaches the point where they can no longer justify giving endlessly, their energy doesn't just lessen, it disappears. The shift is dramatic, not in how it looks on the outside, but in how it feels to the avoidant who has grown used to a particular rhythm. For so long, the avoidant has danced to a pattern they believed was unshakable. They retreat, the empath follows. They withhold, the empath leans in, they distance themselves, and yet somehow the relationship never collapses because the empath refuses to let it. But when the super empath goes ice cold, the pattern shatters, the avoidant takes a step back, and for the first time, no one follows. That silence is louder than any argument they've ever heard. The reason this shocks the avoidant so deeply is because it flips the power dynamic they thought they controlled. Up until now, they believed they held the upper hand by being the one to decide when intimacy happened, and when it was withheld, they assumed the empath's patience was endless, that they would always be waiting on the other side of that wall. But when the empath turns cold, the avoidant suddenly becomes the one left waiting. They are no longer the one deciding when closeness happens. They are experiencing what it feels like to be on the outside, knocking on a door that no longer opens. The ice-cold heart of the super empath isn't vengeful, it's protective. It's a clear signal that the cycle is over. And because empaths usually shift into this state quietly, without drama or blame, the effect is even more destabilizing. The avoidant doesn't get a fiery argument where they can play the role of the victim or the misunderstood partner. They don't get the chance to dismiss the empath's feelings as too much. Instead, they're met with a calm, detached distance. That composure feels alien to them. They can't fight with it, can't reason with it, and most of all, they can't control it. What unsettles the avoidant most is the finality of the silence. When someone who once poured their heart out, gave reassurance, and constantly reached across the gap suddenly stops, it feels like a void. The avoidant has spent so much time fearing being consumed by intimacy that they never considered how much they relied on the other person's presence. Now that presence is gone, and they're left face to face with the emptiness they created. The very stillness they thought they wanted becomes unbearable. This shock comes from the realization that the avoidant was never actually in control. They mistook withdrawal for strength, when in reality, it was the empath's willingness to keep trying that held the relationship together. Once that willingness disappears, the truth becomes undeniable. The avoidant wasn't dictating the relationship. They were depending on the empath to save it each time. And when the empath no longer plays that role, the avoidant finds themselves powerless in a way they've never experienced before. That sudden reversal is what makes the super empath's ice, cold heart impossible for them to handle. When the super empath withdraws their energy, the avoidant is suddenly confronted with a silence that feels heavier than words ever could. For so long, the avoidant has relied on the steady stream of reassurance, attention, and emotional nurturing that the empath provides. Even when they distanced themselves, they knew that emotional safety net was still there, ready to catch them the moment they needed it. But when that net is removed, the absence doesn't feel neutral. It feels like a collapse. The avoidant doesn't just lose a person's affection, they lose the constant emotional oxygen they depended on, often without realizing it. At first, the avoidant might brush it off, convincing themselves that space is what they always wanted. They might even welcome the quiet for a short while, assuming that, like before, the empath will eventually come back with the same warmth and devotion. But this time, the return doesn't happen. Days stretch into weeks, and the familiar rhythm they've relied on no longer exists. What was once comforting distance now starts to feel like abandonment. What was once a strategy for maintaining control begins to backfire, creating the very emptiness they were running from. This panic creeps in slowly but powerfully. The avoidant starts to feel unsettled because the empath's absence exposes just how much they relied on the other person's emotional labor. They didn't realize how much they needed those texts, those reassurances, those gestures of love until they stopped coming. The lack of pursuit, the lack of checking in, and the lack of emotional availability become impossible to ignore. It's not just that the empath is no longer there, it's that the avoidant is forced to sit with their own feelings without the buffer of someone else doing the work for them. The avoidant is now confronted with a mirror. In that mirror, they see the consequences of their own withdrawal. But instead of feeling in control, they feel exposed. The silence highlights the imbalance in the relationship, and with no pursuit to soothe their insecurities, the avoidant is left wrestling with emotions they've long avoided: fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, and fear of intimacy lost forever. This is where the absence of the empath's energy transforms into a kind of psychological panic. What makes it so destabilizing is not just the loss of affection, but the loss of predictability. The empath's presence, no matter how strained, always created a sense of stability. Now that it's gone, the avoidant feels as though the ground beneath them has shifted. The person who once absorbed all the emotional turbulence has stepped away, leaving the avoidant to face the raw weight of their own patterns. For someone who has built their coping mechanisms around escape and distance, being left in that silence is profoundly unsettling. This panic doesn't always show up as desperation right away. Sometimes it manifests as irritability, confusion, or even denial. But beneath all of that is the deep awareness that something vital has been lost. The avoidant, who once believed they could control the ebb and flow of intimacy, realizes too late that the empath's energy was not just a comfort. It was the lifeline of the connection. And once that lifeline is cut, the void left behind feels unbearable. The greatest irony of the avoidance behavior is that the very thing they spend so much time running from, deep intimacy and emotional closeness, is the very thing they end up losing forever when they push away the wrong person. For the avoidant, connection feels dangerous. It stirs up fears of vulnerability, fears of being trapped, and fears of being seen too clearly. So they create distance as a form of self-protection. They convince themselves that pulling back keeps them safe, that it ensures they won't be hurt. What they fail to realize is that their retreat is not just protecting them from imagined pain, it is actively dismantling the bond they secretly crave. When the avoidant meets a super empath, they encounter someone uniquely equipped to handle their initial distance. The super empath has patience, intuition, and a rare depth of compassion. They see past the avoidance walls and, for a time, willingly reach through them. They reassure, they nurture, they hold space for the avoidance fears. This is not weakness, it's strength. But strength doesn't mean unlimited endurance. Eventually, the empath recognizes that love cannot survive if it is always one-sided. And when that recognition turns into action, the avoidant's worst fear comes true. The connection they thought would always be there begins to dissolve. The heartbreak for the avoidant lies in the finality of this shift. Once the super empath goes cold, they don't return to the old pattern. They don't reopen the door that has been slammed shut too many times. They don't chase, don't beg, don't fight for a connection that was never equally honored. The avoidant, used to having endless chances, is suddenly confronted with the reality that there are no more chances left. This is the moment where the walls they built for protection turn into barriers that trap them in loneliness. The loss cuts deeper because the avoidant realizes that the super empath was not like others. The empath had the capacity to understand them in ways most people never could. They had the patience to navigate the avoidant's contradictions, the heart to forgive the push and pull, and the resilience to love despite the distance. Losing someone like that is not like losing an ordinary connection. It's losing the rare person who could meet them at their depth, and that realization doesn't arrive with noise or drama. It arrives in the stillness of being left alone with nothing but their own defenses that no longer serve them. The tragedy is that the avoidant spends so much time running from intimacy that they never pause to see that intimacy was the very thing they needed most. And by the time they recognize it, the super empath has already walked away with their ice-cold heart, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. What remains is a hollow silence that forces the avoidant to face the truth. By avoiding closeness, they didn't just avoid pain, they avoided love. And love, once lost at this depth, rarely returns. So, when we put it all together, the story between the avoidant and the super empath isn't really about who wins or who loses. It's about what happens when love becomes unbalanced. The avoidant runs from the very intimacy they long for, leaning on someone else's effort to hold the relationship together. The super empath, for a time, is willing to give that effort, to pour themselves into the cracks to keep the bond alive. But even the deepest well has a bottom. And when that day comes, when the super empath's heart turns cold, it's not revenge, it's reality. That shift teaches us something powerful. Love cannot survive on one person's shoulders. It takes two people leaning in, two people meeting each other halfway. Because when the balance breaks, even the most patient, loving, empathetic soul will eventually walk away. And once they do, the silence left behind is louder than any argument, stronger than any chase, and final in a way the avoidant never imagined. So the lesson isn't just about avoidants or empaths. It's about all of us. If we want to keep love alive, we have to show up for it. We can't keep taking and expect the giving to never stop. We can't keep pulling away and expect someone to endlessly pull us back. Real love thrives when it's mutual, when it's honored, when it's nurtured by both hearts equally. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for reflecting on this with me. I hope these words serve as a reminder to protect your own heart, to value balance, and to never forget that the right love deserves both your courage and your effort. Goodbye for now, and thank you once again.